And through my experience also, in our experience through the International Center of Abuse of Covert Technologies, we see a broad spectrum of people coming forth. It seems like it's maybe random, maybe not. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the broad spectrum of people that are being victimized, in my mind, is what actually, without having a hard design where you're using people that are consenting to the experimentation, the way you guarantee a random sample is to target a broad spectrum of society, because that way, in the end, the people that are actually looking at the results are actually seeing somewhat or the closest they can get to a random sample. Now, if you know what I mean, that if you're not randomizing them by consent, then you randomize them by victimization. So,
okay. And so does this mean that, so in essence, are we saying that this is a form of experimentation, or is this something else? It really would only make sense that there's some type of study or field study going forward.
No, then that's been my theory all along. I mean, and I'll admit that when I wrote A New Breed, Satellite Terrorism in America, I did write that from the bias that possibly it was, criminals hacking into surveillance systems and using them. And on a couple of other radio shows, I've kind of owned up on why it was written from that perspective. My inside sources that I wanted to continue having as inside sources, it kind of said, well, can you not just blame this straight on the government, just yet, in this book. And so in honor of them, and since they were, forthright enough to actually, give me inside information, that the book was written from that perspective. Now, the book that recently released, Guinea Pigs-Technologies of Control, is not written from that perspective, and it's not a story. It's more about the technology and the history of how we got here. But, my personal belief all along is that this is done so methodically. And if you talk to victims from New York, you talk to victims from Europe, you talk to victims from California, some of the circumstances may be different in their targeting, but the methodologies being used in their targeting are the same. And in my mind, that means that this is being done with somewhat of a cookbook or a handbook or a method book that these perpetrator groups are being given. And, of course, they're using technology that is not technology that you or I can just get online and Google and log into and use on our own. You have to be given access to some of this technology, and you need a clearance to get some of this technology. And so the only thing I can figure is that it's broad spectrum, long-term experimentation to see what the pitfalls of the technology are going to be, what cancers it causes, does it cause permanent nerve damage, does it cause permanent psychiatric change. Okay.
And wouldn't that then fall under consent? Wouldn't if someone's being experimented on, wouldn't we not need to be informed? I know you have addressed that, and that's a topic I'd like to get into next. What's the difference between experimentation, and what are the laws that are regarding the rights of those individuals who are involved in that?
Well, the rights or the need for informed consent within the private sector is actually very strong. A pharmaceutical company or, a private company has really stringent regulations that they have to comply to do experimentation. You have to have an institutional review board. You have to lay out your methodologies, your mission, your abstract. There's a lot of safeguards that go into it. For the government, that's not the case. For the government, there's a set of legislation called the Common Rule. And the Common Rule has a lot of distractors in it that allow the government to have non-consensual experimentation. And, this is a real touchy topic because a lot of victims will contact me and they'll say, well, we have the Helsinki Accord and we have the Nuremberg Code. Those aren't American laws. Those are international suggestions, essentially. They're ethical guidelines, and they're not seen as law anywhere.
Yeah, and has the United States abstained from that, is my understanding, right? Participation in that.
Oh, yeah, well, they certainly force the participation within the private sector on those ethical standards. But, you can see from our past, the Tuskegee experimentation, 60 years later, there's an apology to the people that actually the survivors, the families of the people who were experimented on. Not many of those guys were actually left by the time they exposed it. And then you have the Guatemala thing, which was similar to the Tuskegee experimentation when Hillary Clinton was forced to come out and give a public apology to the Guatemalans for the CDC and the NIH experimenting on them. And that's when we had the bioethics hearings. That's when President Obama decided to call the bioethics commission hearings together with a board of bioethicists who were supposed to determine, are there any non-consensual experimentations going on either globally or in the United States? And I don't remember if you attended any of those. I certainly did. I got up and spoke at one of them. But every one of those meetings, there was easily 1,000 people in the public forum, most of whom were voicing complaints of psychotronic weaponry attack or directed energy attack or covert surveillance methods.
And I did indeed attend one here in the West Coast, and my assistant did submit a question that I had put forth, and it was a question that was very, very similar to the question that Dr. Edward Spencer and Melanie Virtschen submitted in Belgium, in which we got an answer from a Stanford professor who was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and he specifically said, when the question was asked about whether or not the rights of human subjects were being obtained to, he did say within a laboratory setting they were very strict and the standards were being followed. But he did say that in a clinical setting, in other words, in field studies, that is not the case, and he felt that there were stronger regulation that needed to be mandated. And now, here is a professor out of Stanford, right here in my backyard, who did touch on that subject, and thanks to Melanie and Dr. Edward Spencer, we were able to get that on video, and they did record that statement. So that really says a lot about what we're experiencing here in today's time and standard. Now, I guess the ultimate thing is, what is the ultimate goal, in your sense of the word, being someone who's followed this topic for quite some time? What is the ultimate goal of all of these technologies? Is this something that only specific to the United States, or is there a reason why we're hearing from people all over the world that these types of things are happening to them?
Well, I think every industrialized nation probably has developed, these type of methods and these technologies. Certainly, from my study on it, it appears that the Soviet Union had probably brought it forth first on any type of electromagnetic scale, and most of that was to Dr. Igor Smirnov. And when he passed away, his wife actually sold the technology that he had started to the highest bidder. And I know one of those companies was Mantech, which is a private security agency that does nothing but DoD contracts, and I'm assuming that our government agencies themselves probably got their hands on it if private intelligence contractors were able to get it. And, from my research and from the targets that I've talked to and the victims that I've talked to, it's been from all around the world. As a matter of fact, just recently, I think for the first time, I heard from a victim in Turkey. I've heard from victims in Yemen, Japan, Russia, China, India, Pakistan. I mean, pick a country, I've heard from somebody there. So it obviously is global, and I don't necessarily think that it's agencies from our government doing all of it, but the troubling thing with the fact that it's global is one has to question, especially with the reports that have been sent to the UN, and a lot of victims have sent reports to the UN. Is the UN really looking at this seriously as something that they should be preventing, or is the UN part of the problem? And that's a question that I've been kind of tangling with in my mind here of late.
Yeah, and you're right. You're right on every one of those points. I believe the United States did win the bid for Smirnov's through Smirnov's technology, where his wife had taken over. I think it was over $990 million that was offered to her for his work in the technology where they'd come to point today. Of course, with ICAACT, we hear from victims all over the world: Korea, as you state, Pakistan, every single place on this planet, it seems, that we're hearing from victims all complaining of the same thing. And it's unfortunate. So I guess is the ultimate goal total control, and what is the benefit, I guess? Is there a benefit in doing these types of things, manipulating someone's mind, utilizing technology, in a way that is unspoken. The negative aspects of it are unspoken, but ultimately, do you see a good coming out of this, or is this all doom and gloom?
Talked about this before, and I'll be honest with you. I mean, the technology is not going to go away. I mean, there's been too much money spent on perfecting it. Is there a good side of this technology? Well, yeah. I mean, if it's, there are good things that could be done with it medically. In a time of war, if it's being used in a true war setting, it was mostly invented as a weapon system. I really particularly don't necessarily have a problem with that if it's being used in a war setting. What I have a problem with is it being used on innocent civilians in an experimental setting, or getting in the hands of people that are using it criminally on innocent civilians. As far as where it's going and why all the research is being done and why we're seeing it, happen on a global scale, at the risk of sounding conspiratorial, because all my lectures that I've done and all the radio shows that I've done, I try to stick with facts. And what I'm about to say sounds like something from a conspiracy theory show. But the only direction I can see this going, especially since every industrialized nation has it and is using it on their own citizens, is for global control. And I know that kind of harkens to sound conspiratorial, but what else can it be? I mean, we both know that with this technology you can control emotions and you can control decisions. And Vladimir Putin, a couple of years ago, came out in a statement and said it pretty forthrightly that whatever country has the best psychotronic weaponry will control the globe without bullets or missiles. What he didn't expand on is the way you do that is by controlling the decision making.
Do you see anything in the near future? I know in your book you talk about the history, and the history is really dark, unfortunately. And but do you see any hope in where there is some type of relief or some type of way that victims can have or be taught some coping mechanisms to deal with this?
Well, and that's one of the things we've been working, through ICAACT to kind of come up with some of those, and we, I'm sure we'll speak later. We've had some highlights in California. I think one of the things that's going to have to be at the forefront is educating the non-target population. The people that are chosen for targeting, there's not much we're going to do to stop that because we don't have anybody in those perpetrator groups or in those agencies to know how the randomization is. But it's the non-targeted family members, people you work with, your friends are the ones that, when you do get victimized, they're the ones that are end up recommending you or forcing you into psychiatric facilities for exams. And the psychiatric diagnosis you get after being a victim is almost as damning as being victimized by the technology itself. So once everybody is at least exposed to be educated that this technology exists, I think it'll have a lot less effect on the victims. Because once everybody knows the cat's out of the bag, yes, the government has technology that can put voices in your head and attack you with directed energy weapons and stalk you remotely. Once everybody knows that, then as the complaints come forward, they'll be less apt to send to psychiatrists because the psychiatric diagnosis you get from this is equally damning.
It's almost like they're being victimized a second time around when they get pushed that way, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, and then it's sad that, there's so much, there's a lot of BS online about this, but there's a lot of legitimate studies, and certainly coming out of ICAACT and some of the other support groups. And even when these people put this in front of a psychiatrist, they don't look at any of it. They don't bother to get online and say, well, wow, this isn't just one person in my office complaining of this. This is 300,000 people nationwide and even more globally. And any physician, any scientist should look at that and go, this isn't one person coming to me with this complaint. This is 60 guys in one city in California all hearing the same voice and all being attacked with directed energy, none of whom knew each other until somebody passed around flyers and rounded up everybody that was hearing it. Anybody that's ever been in a scientific lab or done any type of scientific study or is in medicine should say, this isn't mental illness, this is experimentation.
Melanie has a question for you.
Dr. Hall, the trailer for the movie Targeted